After wishing you Shavua Tov, we're going to start here on Daf Lamites, Itmar. So if you count down from the top of the Omud, it's really the fourth line down. Hashochet es habehema lizog domel avodas kochavim. So watch what's going on here. He shechted an animal, and at the time of the shechita, he had in mind that the zrikas hadam would be for the sake of avodah zarah. And that's called Mechashvim Me'avoda Lavoda, which is a major sugya in Masechtes Vachim with regard to Kodshim, and it's going to come up right here. Or Lahaktir Chelba Lavodas Kochavim. He had in mind at the time of the Shechita that he would take the Chelev and he would maktir it for idolatry. Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Psula, Rabbi Shimon Lakish Muteres. Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Psula, Mechashvim Me'avoda Lavoda. So in effect, the machshava that he had at the time of one avoda, namely the avodas hashchita, registers even though his machshava was for another avoda, whether it be for the dam or for the chelev. The alfinan chutz mipnim. Now, what does that mean, pnim? Pnim here is a reference to kodshim. Chutz is a reference to avodah zarah. The shechita, for the sake of avodah zarah, was outside the confines of the mikdash. That's called chutz. But in pnim, where in shechitas kodshim, we have a precedent for mechashvin me'avoda lavoda, and that's called pigul. If at the time of the shechita he has in mind that he's going to do the other avodos, primarily the zrika, li'achar zmano, that generates pigul. So we see already that pigul, by definition, is predicated on the principle of machashva me'avoda lavoda, meaning the machshava that he had at the time of the shechita registers even though it's related to another avoda. Reish Lakish Amar muteres. Now, you have to be a little careful here. When Reish Lakish says muteres, he doesn't deny that the avoda here is avodah zarah, which means that whatever punitive measures would apply to this person, they'll apply. But now the question is, what about the basar of the animal that he shechted? And that's where Reish Lakish insists muteres, because ein mechashim me'avoda lavoda, and lo gamrinan chutz mipnim, meaning even though pigul, as we said before in Rabbi Yochanan, sets a precedent for machashim me'avoda lavoda, that's only bifnim. But bachutz, with regard to shchitas chullin, in this case, the shchita of an animal for shchita purposes, then we don't derive that from the precedent of pnim. Tamayu, and this machlokes shin Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish is really an old machlokes, and each one is consistent with his shita. Di itmar shchato lishma, and we're going to add two words just for clarification. Al minas lizrok doma shelo lishma. He shechted it for the sake of, let's say, a karban ola, but he has in mind at the time of the shechita that the zrikas hadam will be not for a karban ola, but rather for a karban shlamim. Or, for example, although he shechted a chatos for the sake of a chatos, but he had in mind that he's going to be zorik the dam l'shem shlamim. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Psula and Reish Lakish Amar Ksher. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Psula machashvim me'avoda lavoda. The machshava that he had at the time of the shechita registers, and even though his machshava was at time of the shechita for another avoda, namely for zrikas hadam, nevertheless, it is registered, and therefore the carbon is possible. It's like a shalol lishma. And I think we said once that in chatos, shalol lishma completely passels the carbon. And then Rabbi Yochanan says, Gamrinan mimachshavas pigul, meaning, how do I know that if he had a machshava of lishma at the time of zrika, almanas shalol lishma of zrika, that is considered like shalol lishma, machashmel, that we learn from pigul. Rav Shimon Lakish Amar Kshera, the carbon is kosher, and that machshava that he had at the time of the zrika, at the time of the shchita, for the zrika doesn't register at all. It's command the lesser dummy. So pigul is the exception where everybody, even Reish Lakish, agrees that machashim me'avodah lavodah. So if he had in mind at the time of the shchitas carbon that he would be zorik the dam chutz l'zmano, then it generates pigul, and the carbon is completely possible, it's also bando, etc., etc. But Reish Lakish says that's a separate din in pigul, and we cannot derive any conclusions from pigul. It's not a precedent for other avodos. Utzricha. Now the Gemara wants to analyze, why do I need the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish twice? We learned it once with regard to Kodshim, and now we're learning it with regard to Avodah Zarah in Chullin. Di'i itmar baha, if we only had the case of Chullin, meaning where he shechted it for the purpose of being zorik the dam or makta the chelet for Avodah Zarah, I would have said, Behaka Amar Reb Shimon Lakish. Here is where Reb Shimon Lakish says that, you know what? You can't compare chutz lipnim. You can't compare a shchita of chulin in the sugya of Avodah Zarah with the shchita of kodshim. Shum de chutz lipnim lo yachlina. Avol pnim mi pnim. But in the case where at the time of the shchita of a carbon, let's say a chatos, he had in mind that he would be zorik the dam l'shem shlamim, in such a case, moda ema moda leila Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Reish Lakish would say that here within the confines of kodshim, we could derive one kodshim from another, and pigul becomes your paradigmic case. But v'iyet mabahach, if we only had the machlokes in the case of kodshim, by he ka'am Rabbi Yochanan, here's where Rabbi Yochanan is willing to extrapolate and derive the principle of machashim avodah lavodah from pigul to the case of l'shem chatos l'shem zrikas shlamim. Aval b'ha, but in the case of chulin, namely in shchitas avodah zarah, Ema, I might think, modu leil Reb Shimon Lakish. He would concede to Reb Shimon Lakish. Therefore, tzricha, I need both cases. Masiv Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes is going to introduce Rabbi Yossi, and he's going to show that Rabbi Yossi rejects both Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah had the following logic. This is the Kal V'chomer of Rabbi Yossi. Kal V'chomer Advar. Uma b'mokom shemachshava poselos b'mukdashim. Now, here's the case where, let's say that so-and-so comes over to a shochet and asks him to shecht the animal. And that so-and-so is the bailim, he owns the animal, and he decides in his mind that he wants this animal, which is now being shechted by a shochet, to have its dam or its chelev brought for avodah zarah. And the halacha is that it's the oved, the one who's actually doing the shechita, his mindset will determine the shechita, not the bailim who owns the animal. And therefore, says Rabbi Yossi, in the case of kodshim, we have a principle called machshava poseles. And that's the beginning of Maseches Vachim, is all about a machshava poseles. Like, for example, chatos l'shem shlomim, or shchita lizok domo liachar zmana. But nevertheless, ein hakol holich el achar ha'oved. We're not interested in what crosses the mind of the Bailim who own the carbon, own the animal, but rather the determining factor is what crosses the mind, what was the intention of the Oved, the Kohen. Well, in the case of Shechita, it doesn't have to be a Kohen, but the one who did the Shechita. And therefore, Mokum she'ein machshava poseles bechulin, we don't have any halacha in chulin of a machshava poseles. We don't care what's in the mind of shchitas chulin, that he had in mind this or that. It's a no din, how much more so shelo yeh kol holich ela achar shochet. Now, let's try, says Rav Sheshes, to analyze the underlying premise of Rabbi Yossi. What did Rabbi Yossi mean when he said in our Mishnah, Ein machshava poseles bechulin? Ki'ilu, as if he'd said that machshava is totally irrelevant in chulin. If he meant to say that the machshava of the shochet in chulin doesn't passel any shchita at all, and it's totally irrelevant, and there's no din or significance to machshava, then how would we ever find a case where because of shchita, it generates an iser on the carbon, on the meat of the carbon, which is an iser avodah zarah? It must be because the shochet had in mind that this is going to be we'll call it an adulterous cultic act. So we have to come up with another, interpretation of what Rabbi Yossi means when he says that ein machshava poseles bechulin. It can't be that take it at face value that there's no significance to machshava. Ella, but by process of elimination, pshita, it must be me'avoda le'avoda. For sure, the machshava l'shem oved kochavim at the time of the shechita would certainly generate all the isurim of avodah zarah. But what the Kalvachomer of Rabbi Yossi was Hachikomar Ma b'mokash machshava posels mukdashim avodah levoda. In the case of kachim, machshava will passel from one avoda to the other. For example, in the case of Pigel, where he had in mind at the time of the shechita that he would be zorik the dam chutz l'zmano, and nevertheless, ein hakol holech ela achar ha'oved. The determining factor which will passel the carbon is the machshava of the oved. Is kal v'chomer, how much more so, mokum she'ein machshava posels b'chul me'avoda la'avoda, that a machshava during one avoda, let's say during shchita, that another avoda, let's say zrikas adam or aktoras hachelev, would be done for the sake of avodah zarah, is a nodin shelo yehei kol holechet alachar shochet. It means that Rabbi Yossi is saying that there's a fundamental difference between kachim and chulin, because in kachim we have our halacha of machashva me'avoda lavoda, whereas in chulin there's no machshava me'avoda lavoda. So the Gemara now is going to demonstrate that this kal v'chomer and all the premises that are assumed by this kal v'chomer of Rabbi Yossi, and keep in mind Rabbi Yossi's a Tana, will contradict both Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Pnim kashel Rav Shimon ben Lakish. After all, according to Rav Shimon ben Lakish, even in avodas hakarbon, ein mechashvi me'avoda lavoda, and yet Rabbi Yossi assumed as a simple premise that mechashvi me'avoda lavoda. Excuse me for 1 minute, sorry. It's a very important call. So that's the kasha from Rabbi Yossi on Reish Lakish. And that's pnim lepnim. Because Reish Lakish denies the principle of machashim me'avoda lavoda in pnim, in kodshim, whereas certainly Rabbi Yossi explicitly accepts it. And chutz kasha Rabbi Yochanan. But in terms of chutz, we have a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan because according to Rabbi Yossi, there's no din of machashim me'avoda lavoda b'chutz, which is fine according to Reish Lakish, but it's against Rabbi Yochanan. So Gemara says the following: Bishleim pnim l'Rab Shimon Lakshlo kasha hamakami d'shama Rabbi Yochanan ha lebasa d'shama Rabbi Yochanan. Meaning, before he heard Rabbi Yochanan's presentation, he was of the opinion that ein machashim avoda lavoda in avodas pnim in kodshim. After he heard Rabbi Yochanan, who was a little bit of his rebbe, he conceded and retracted his statement. El chutz kashel Rabbi Yochanan. But what are we going to do with the contradiction of Rabbi Yochanan? And the Gemara says Rav Sheshes, who raised this contradiction, is going to answer and resolve the contradiction. Mosiv lavu mefarikla barba avodos. Rabbi Yossi is talking about number one, shchita; number two, kabbalah sadam; number three, holacha sadam; number four, zrika sadam. Those are the four avodos. Ma b'makom shemachshava poselos b'mukdashim be'arba avodos. In mukdashim, a machshava in any one of those four avodos would passel the korban, and nevertheless, ein hakol holech ela achar ha'oved. The determining factor to passel the korban with a machshava poselis is totally in the arena of the oved. So, in theory, let's say you have four kohanim ovdim. Any one of those four kohanim ovdim could have a machshava poselis during his avodah. But the bailim, we don't register their machshava at all. It's totally irrelevant.